Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad France, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyakin here with a big week of World War III analysis. We're going to be discussing, of course, all things in the greater Israel-Middle East front regarding the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, Israel's new big strikes on Lebanon, the first since the supposed ceasefire, first big ones on Beirut, as it were, since the supposed ceasefire that wasn't really a ceasefire went into place back in November. We're going to be discussing Israel's new bases deeper and deeper into Syria, as well as, of course, new things going on in Syria as it emerges as this new Sunni majority state. We're going to be talking about everything Israel has been doing in Gaza, the Gaza flotilla, what's going on in the West Bank, the new strikes from the Houthis, the latest political turmoil within Israel itself, which, continues to mount as Netanyahu, again, the fact that he's held on to power for this long does show he is, he has quite the political acumen. We're then going to, of course, shift to talking about Russia and Ukraine, Russia's big advances on the front line, Putin's phone call with Trump, Russia's impending response to the big Ukrainian strike on its air forces, the reality of that we have learned more and more, so updates on that attack in general. We're also going to talk about Trump's phone call with Xi Jinping, the latest on the Palantir front, of course, Trump's huge blow-up with Elon Musk in the midst of his, big, beautiful bill that he is trying to get passed. We're going to talk about Africa, everything going on there, some other updates from Asia, as well as some big church news, of course, some very unfortunate news regarding Metropolitan Neophytos and the church in Cyprus, as it appears that now that Metropolitan Tychikos was deposed, the Synod has turned its ire towards Metropolitan Neophytos, so we're going to give you a big update on all of that, Rokor's recent statements that we very much approve of, as well as, of course, church persecution updates. I want to make sure everybody also, not only likes this episode, which you, of course, should do, whether you're listening on Substack or YouTube, but also check out our latest Ether Hour episode. Dmitry and I talk all about the history of Imperial Russia in Syria and Palestine. We review the book by Dr. Najib Saliba about Tsarist Russia defending Orthodox interests in Syria. So be sure to check that out. Get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co and get access to all of our Ether Hour content, again, for just $7 a month, or again, just get a month for free if you share the show through Substack with over 3 people. I believe you can get a free month behind the paywall. So thank you to everybody who does that. Again, worldwarnow.co. Check that out. That will be linked down below our latest Ether Hour episode. But with all of that, we have to hop into this analysis. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Happy to be back with another episode of World War Now on D-Day, the 6th of June, 2025. Very important, the landing at Normandy. I know for many Americans, it's an important day. Many of your ancestors actually participated in this great battle, or series of battles in Western Europe. So again, we respect all veterans regardless of which particular side they fought for in these various conflicts, because again, they fought for things which they believed in. But speaking of things people believe in, it's quite clear now when we look at the Middle East, in particular the negotiations between the US, most likely on behalf of Israel, and Iran, right, the great Persian civilization trying to again, climb out of the economic hole into which it's been dragged by the international globalists. And I would say probably the Soviet Union as well, which it hasn't really collaborated with since 1979. And again, the Russian Federation really has reconciled that relationship between the Russians and the Iranians. However, Donald J. Trump has shown his conviction, I think, despite Steve Witkoff's soft approaches to some of the peace talks with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, that he's adamant that Iran should not have any uranium enrichment whatsoever. And this is a fairly strong statement. It was made at the beginning of this week, probably around the 3rd of June. And this really flies in the face of everything we've kind of been preparing for. What are the point of these peace talks, right, Conrad, was that Iran would completely sign off on all these agreements, guarantee that there would be no weapons developments with any nuclear technology whatsoever. However, they would be allowed some degree of nuclear enrichment, possibly as long as they not normalize with Israel, but essentially end this ever-escalatory conflict that they've had with the Israeli Zionist state. And this was basically the foundational ideas behind all of these 5 or 6 rounds of negotiations between America and Iran. And unfortunately, I think it's reached a certain point of no return. And I say this very importantly because Pete Hegseth, Trump's defense secretary, minister of defense, essentially highlights and underlines what Trump has stated earlier in the week. And he said that the US aims to be ready if the Iran talks fail. What does he mean by that? Pete Hegseth, we know he's a big-time hawk. We know he's a avowed proud Zionist. He's an evangelical, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, Steve Bannon recently in an interview stated that even traditional Catholics are traditional Zionists. So, like, it's not just the evangelicals who support Israel. Traditional Catholics apparently have to support Israel as well. But we know Steve Bannon is a paid-for shill, and we know who probably runs him and pays him off these days. But people are anticipating, Conrad, that the White House and their talks with Iran, and remember that deadline that Donald J. Trump set for Iran, because it commenced on 12th of April, the timeline. And technically, the deadline is expected to fall around the 12th of June of this year, which is exactly as the recording of this episode, which is in 6 days. So middle of next week, it's looking very tense at the moment. Israeli politicians have openly stated that they will not be striking Iran until negotiations fail, which, I mean, is incredibly hawkish. You can imagine Israel has openly said that these negotiations have not been successful thus far. Yes, they've been cordial and they've been amicable to some extent. Like Araqchi and the Iranians have actually traveled to Europe, to places of essentially Christian domination. They've traveled to the Gulf states. They've spoken at almost every single level. They've bent the knee as much as they could have to some extent. However, Iran has made it very clear, and I'll just read out a citation from the foreign minister of Iran, who at this point, I believe, despite all the possible conceived differences inside of the Iranian administration, that he's speaking for the country of Iran here. So the foreign minister Abbas Araghchi of Iran said the following: "There is a reason why only a few nations master the ability to fuel nuclear reactors. Apart from significant financial resources and political vision, it requires a solid industrial base and a technological academic complex that can produce necessary human resources and know-how. Iran has paid dearly for these capabilities, and there is no scenario in which we will give up on the patriots who had made our dream come true. To reiterate, no enrichment means no deal. No nuclear weapons, and then we have a deal," said Abbas Araghchi. So it's very clear what Iran's position is. Donald Trump clearly does not align with that stance. Pete Hegseth is on board with Donald J. Trump entirely. It appears that Israel is too. And so the only speculative, I guess, confirmation of future war of Iran, Conrad, that we may have is that if these negotiations do fail, and if this deadline means anything, which it may not, frankly, a lot of deadlines over the last few years have been broken. For example, the Russo-Ukrainian, all kinds of discussions that they've had, all kinds of red lines have been breached. These deadlines essentially may not mean anything in reality. However, we do have this specter of looming Middle Eastern war upon us here. And now that Syria also is being essentially divided, just like Poland was divided in the late 1700s, I think there's a proper scenario of future Iranian war that is essentially coming upon the Middle East. And I think the entire world will be negatively affected by that.
No, I completely agree. And I think the best way we can decipher Israel's comments, at least regarding their willingness or lack of willingness to strike in the midst of these negotiations, I mean, obviously Trump sort of undermining Witkoff and the deal that I'm sure he himself approved initially regarding enrichment clearly has to do with behind the scenes Israeli chain pulling. And I think when Israel was openly talking about, we will strike Iran if there's a deal, that was, I think, at their, what you could describe as their lowest moment, where they actually thought that there was going to be a deal that really could de-escalate, the path to war that we've been seeing right now. But the fact that they're now saying, oh, if there's a good deal, then we're not going to strike. But if there is, we will. I think that's a good evidence that there isn't going to be some kind of good deal. Again, like you said, the initial deadline was this past Sunday. There's now been this extension on the negotiations. And in the midst of all of this, of course, I think the other big news in this circle is that there's been an IAEA report that said Iran carried out secret nuclear activities at undeclared sites using uranium metal for small-scale tests related to nuclear weapons. A Western-backed resolution may formally find Iran in non-compliance for the first time in 20 years, and this could escalate tensions and derail nuclear talks with the U.S. This is from Geo Insider. And in response to this, Abbas Araghchi, who, again, Iran was warning Western countries against using this as some sort of evidence for retaliation or escalation diplomatically against Iran. But Abbas Araghchi, he said, after years of good cooperation with the IAEA resulting in a resolution which shut down malign claims of a possible military dimension to Iran's peaceful nuclear program, my country is once again accused of non-compliance. Instead of engaging in good faith, the E3, which is the UK, Germany, and France, is opting for malign action against Iran at the IAEA Board of Governors. When the E3 engaged in the same foul conduct back in 2005, the outcome in many ways was the true birth of uranium enrichment in Iran. Has the E3 truly learned nothing in the past 2 decades? Falsely falsely accusing Iran of violating safeguards based on shoddy and politicized reporting is clearly designed to produce a crisis. Mark my words, as Europe ponders another major strategic mistake, Iran will react strongly against any violation of its rights, blame lies solely and fully with irresponsible actors who stop at nothing to gain relevance. So, yeah, that was Arakchi who said that. And then, again, in response to that, the chief of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, said he's optimistic about indirect talks between Iran and the United States. He also said Iran's nuclear capabilities cannot be destroyed by military attacks, as most sensitive sites are half a mile underground and difficult to access. So I think that's the biggest reason why Israel, again, they are much more interested in striking Iran with the assistance and support of the United States as opposed to on their own, because ultimately, if they did it on their own, they really would maybe if with some of their biggest capabilities, short of, unleashing their nuclear arsenal, they would be able to destroy some of these sites, but I don't think they would be able to destroy all of them. So again, in the midst of these, I don't know the exact next location and time for the negotiations. The last one's in Rome. Again, the United States seems to be wanting to say they went well. Iran doesn't seem to think they're going particularly well. The Ayatollah, as he's expressed, doesn't seem to think they should be going on at all. So between him and then the more open-minded Pezeshkian government, you sort of have Arakchi sort of representing the consensus that, okay, maybe we can talk to you, but we're not just gonna roll over and take whatever you have because we're supposedly afraid of a strike from you and Israel. Because clearly, I'm sure Iran has many contingency plans for when the negotiations do inevitably fail. And I think that's when the interesting question about how is Russia going to respond, is Russia's guarantee that Israel cannot be destroyed by Iran, does that extend to them restraining Iran from doing what needs to be done to, assert its sovereignty? What will China do? These are the questions that we have talked about extensively on the show. I talked about them with Jason Moranchuk on our stream back there. And of course, recent new sanctions against Iran from the Trump administration have come out. This comes amidst talk of new sanctions against Russia, which we will talk about in a second. But again, I think the fact that Iran has seen a lot of its, axis of resistance dismantled by Israel throughout the Middle East, I think in many ways, they are very prepared to strike Israel in the event that, these negotiations fail and they have their nuclear sites attacked. But I think, again, I don't know how, far along Iran's, more secret nuclear dealings are, because I'm sure the IAEA report is probably somewhat accurate. Maybe not specifically, but I'm sure, let's be honest, we know Iran is going to be pursuing this because if the Iranian regime, knows what's good for it, they realize the only path towards ultimate security is becoming a nuclear regime. So I think, again, unfortunately, the month of June, July, I really do think these are going to be the months that make or break it when it comes to Iran, and maybe August as far as the strikes are concerned, but I think this summer could tell the tale of the prophesied strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities.
Unfortunately, that's the case, Conrad, and I think this will simultaneously take place with either a Ukrainian strike against Russia, which we know they are preparing for. Obviously, Ukraine has been playing very mellow, and when we speak about Ukrainian tactics in a moment, exactly what they've been doing, but it does seem like there's a calm before the storm taking place in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And I think that if these two battles align, Russia will not be in a position to aid Iran if a joint strike between, say, the Gulf states, America, as well as Israel take place against the Iranian Islamic Republic. So it'll be very interesting and a very tense period now that we've entered, the summer of 2025. So interesting and unfortunate news, taking place in Gaza as well. We've been covering the long-suffering Palestinian people and their genocide by the IDF, by Israel, for quite a while now, over 20 months. And, it only gets crazier. So just in the last 24 hours, independent news sources have confirmed that almost 100 people have been killed. Aid has been entirely blocked. There were some aid trucks which managed to get in, about 8 or 9 aid trucks. Look, 8 or 9 trucks of aid are just not going to support a population of 1.5+ million people. And I say 1.5 million people because I believe the population has probably decreased rapidly from the 2.1 or 2.2 million that it was before October 7th. So I think we're looking at hundreds, thousands of people that have passed. And I'm not even sure they're receiving proper burials at the moment. So the casualty rate is insane. It's probably reaching the levels of the Russo-Ukrainian war, perhaps even surpassing it quite dramatically. But some of the other news in relation to Palestine, besides, Greta Thunberg, which we'll speak about in a moment, but the Israeli military conducted these massive airstrikes, which, dealt a huge blow to the civilian population, essentially these terror strikes. They don't necessarily report on how many Hamas fighters they've killed, but over 100 people have died in Jabalia Deir al-Balah, and Khan Yunis. So this is like central to center south, Palestine, Gaza. Unfortunately, these strikes continue most of the time hitting civilians. I don't think there's been a single airstrike by the IDF, by the Israeli Air Force, that has hit only exclusively Hamas-based targets. So Hamas has very intricately integrated itself among the civilian population. I'm not necessarily like a big fan of exactly those war tactics, to be frank. However, the Israelis use that as a pretext in order to conduct genocide. So it's quite clear that there's a major culprit in this entire story that we've covered for the last more than a year and a half at this point, closing in on 2 years. It's very interesting that the United Nations, again, does not react at all in terms of course, any resolutions any resolutions that have been passed have been vetoed. So the US has vetoed a fifth resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. This is the Security Council attempting to halt the fighting taking place in Palestine immediately. So notice these ceasefire votes have taken place, and they are, I think, more determinative than even what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, because here at least we have two more or less equally sized militaries fighting against one another, one with Western aid, one with pure national production of weaponry. Here we have mostly an insurgency plus a huge civilian population being killed, as well as essentially an Israeli army being supported and funded by America. It's clearly there's a massive imbalance here. So obviously the Security Council understands that. They're not fools, these diplomats and ambassadors who show up to the UN. But again, it's the US that vetoed it. So we understand who, out of the Trump administration, his diplomatic corps, represented in the United Nations in New York, who exactly they're working for, or who they're allied with at the very least, if you're a pro-MAGA, pro-Trump sort of leaning person. At the very least, you can see that Trump is very much playing up to the Israeli war plans in the Gaza Strip and Palestine. And in the West Bank as well, there's been at least 2 settler attacks by violent Zionists on some villages east of Ramallah. This is the capital of the Palestinians in the West Bank, so very close to the biggest population of Palestinians. And many of the Palestinians, of course, are rural. They don't live in these major cities, and there's been dozens of wounded Palestinians, none killed, fortunately. However, this does speak to that inevitable possibility, Conrad, that we've been mentioning of essentially a cleansing of not just the Islamic population of the West Bank, but also the Christians. And this is most likely what will happen after the Israelis are done with their genocidal plans in Gaza, Palestine. And I don't think they just involve the removal of Hamas. I think it goes a little bit beyond that. But it's not just Gaza and Palestine that's being affected. Israel has also bombed Beirut, the southern suburbs. So it's at the actual capital city of Lebanon. And it's interesting because Abbas Araghchi this week has also visited. So this is the foreign minister of Iran. He's been quite busy, as we can see. He's visited and spoken to Joseph Aoun, the new president of Lebanon. Most likely they spoke about Hezbollah, the Shia community in Lebanon, and some of those connections, especially things that have changed since the fall of Syria, most likely very important conversations, which, again, we don't have many details about what they spoke about. But as you can imagine, the situation is incredibly tense in Lebanon. The country can, at any point, escalate into a fully fledged civil war, potentially, with certain sides agreeing with Israel and turning against essentially their Muslim co-nationalists, right? They're of one essential ethnicity, one nationality at the very least, but the differences in ideology, in alliance with Israel, and their allegiance to, I guess, this quasi-Judeo-Christian, conglomerate that's been formed in the Middle East since the British Empire is, I think, that may lead them to fight against their brothers and sisters who are Shia Muslims and potentially Sunni Muslims as well. So very dire situation there. So, and again, the Muslims were having the Eid al-Adha sort of feast day holiday as well in Beirut. So there were a lot of people in the streets, many people visiting relatives in Beirut, probably coming from rural places. And again, Israel choosing this as an optimal time to bomb not just south of the Litani River, many of these so-called Hezbollah bases, but also the southern suburbs of Beirut. The official excuse for Israel's bombing of a suburban block in Beirut was that Hezbollah had a drone production factory somewhere in the basement or in the building itself, which at this point we don't even know who to believe, right? We don't really want to believe Hezbollah. Obviously many countries have it listed as a terrorist organization. However, the IDF has really proven themselves to produce a body count more than any other terrorist organization on the planet, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS at this point. So, we're essentially dealing with he said, she said, and it's tough to trust Israel, of course, just based on their reports of who exactly they're trying to aim for and bomb. And sort of moving on to Syria, just very briefly, Conrad, I think it's important to note that I mentioned earlier, Syria is being heavily divided. At the moment, we know that the Syrian military, a large portion of it, they're wearing literally Turkish-produced uniforms, Turkish boots. They're having Turkish weapons. They use, again, the Turkish lira is used in the Idlib province still. The Turkish military at least controls a certain portion of the new Syrian government's resources. We know that for sure. And in our conversation with Alia and our conversation with Maram, Syrian girl, I think we've come to this conclusion that essentially Syria is going to be at least de facto, maybe even de jure, divided amongst these great powers. And unfortunately, it won't be like the division of Poland in the late 1700s, because at least Poland was divided among brotherly, Christian, civilized nations, such as the Kingdom of Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Holy Roman Empire, and the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. So at least the Polish people were treated with respect, and they were sort of integrated, as Polish communities, as Polish cities with other Christian nations. Here we have essentially other countries such as Israel, Turkey, and the Gulf states, which have used Syria in a very predatory fashion. And proof of that is the 7 Israeli bases that are now confirmed to have been set up in the Quneitra province. If you look at a map of Syria, the most southwestern province is a sliver of land, very small. I would say it's probably a lot smaller than even maybe the size of Donetsk, perhaps a lot, Donetsk Oblast, maybe half of Donetsk Oblast, very small. It actually aligns with Damascus, is very close. I reckon if Israel places some missile launchers in the Quneitra province in some of these bases, they can actually reach Damascus very easily if they have some of these Western weapon systems. A very dangerous proximity to the capital city of Syria, even if the capital city at the moment is controlled by these jihadi Islamists led by al-Jilani al-Shara. But it does seem like the Israelis are not leaving these lowlands. Of course, through warfare in the 20th century, they did gain those Golan Heights, which is a huge advantage for the Israelis. It's not just like a rhetorical high ground, it's also like militarily, strategically, it allows the Israelis to launch some of their operations into both Lebanon and Syria alike, and it gives them a gigantic advantage in the region. But now they're looking at the lowlands, the valleys and the hillsides of the Quneitra province, possibly even further than that, like As-Suwayda province and the Daraa province, also leading up into Damascus. These are all these small provinces in the southwestern portion of Syria, potentially under threat. So we do see a complete division of Syria. And why I mention, the Gulf states is because, well, this news came as a huge surprise to me because, frankly, it didn't make any headlines, Conrad, except for some certain Middle Eastern publications like Al Jazeera, which again is led by Qatar. But they mentioned very briefly that Saudi Arabia and Qatar will jointly fund Syrian state salaries for the public sector and boost economic recovery plans. What this means is that the Syrian government essentially will be run by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, these two Wahhabi-funding, radical extremist Salafi-funding countries of the Gulf states. And we know that they're very closely aligned with both Israel, they're closely aligned with America, especially. We've heard about Trump's recent visit. We've covered that 2 weeks ago. Like, Syria essentially is completely occupied by foreign forces, not just in the north by Turkey, by the US-controlled Kurds in the east. I mean, the 2 Russian bases are probably the least of the Syrian people's concerns in the west, of course, in Latakia and Latakia Khmeimim and Tartus. And of course, what can we even say? The Gulf states now also intervening, trying to keep a leash on these former Arabized communities. But mind you, this goes back to Muhammad's time, the Rashidun Caliphs, when they were conquering Syria and taking it from both the Persian Zoroastrians as well as the Orthodox Christian Byzantines. Syria was one of the first lands which the Arab Muslims conquered in the 600s AD. So keep in mind, this is a very historical place for the Gulf Arabs to be looking in terms of natural expansion points. And I think they're going to use that sort of theologically to justify some of their positions in terms of supporting the local terrorists, in terms of supporting some of these regimes which may have an affinity for Sharia law and some of these other very rough Islamic practices, which again will place a lot of pressure on not just the Alawites and some of the other communities, the Yazidis, the Druze, but also the Christians who don't necessarily want those sort of legislative changes. They don't really want to pay the jizya, which again is not being installed, but who knows what the future holds. So yeah, it does appear, Conrad, that the fate of the Syrian state, essentially, we're looking at a second division, not just like the one that took place with the Sykes-Picot Agreement at the beginning of the 20th century following the First World War. I think Syria as an independent sovereign state is in its twilight days, and the sun is setting, and very much we're approaching sort of the midnight phase of Syrian sovereignty. Whether or not the Arab sovereign Syrians will ever gain prominence ever again under another family, such as the Assads, we're not too sure, but we note that Dr. Bashar al-Assad didn't even appear for the 9th of May protests in Moscow, so it does seem like him and his family in Russia have completely retired from politics, similar to the former president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, who was overthrown in 2013 in the Maidan, also has left politics almost entirely. So it does seem like once these politicians are overthrown locally, they just never make a return back to prominence. It's very interesting how some of these things align. There are clear analogies that we can draw.
Yeah, I think your analysis of all those fronts where Greater Israel is expanding are very much relevant. You mentioned, of course, Israel striking. As I mentioned last week, they aren't just striking, now expanding into Beirut and even farther north in Lebanon, but tanks, bulldozers have moved into southern Lebanon with the IDF supporting them on the ground. So, the full territorial expansion of Zion is continuing. You mentioned the bases being built. Again, I believe it's 7+ new military bases in Syria, not including, of course, the Golan Heights that Israel has occupied for a long time now. So in El Quneitra and Dara province, there are over 7 new Israeli military bases. You mentioned the attacks from the settlers in the West Bank. And of course, the situation in Gaza continues to dramatically deteriorate. Israel recently struck the courtyard of the Al-Ali Arab Baptist Hospital in Gaza City, killing 4 journalists and at least 2 other civilians. The hospital is run by the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem, which strongly condemned the attack in a statement that was released before a 4th journalist was declared dead. This morning at about 10:20 a.m. local time, Israeli forces fired inside the compound of our Al-Ali hospital in Gaza City, killing 3 journalists as well as 2 others, including a father who was escorting his son to our surgical unit for treatment for previous injuries, the diocese said. In addition, this unprovoked assault against civilians wounded 30 other bystanders, among them 4 of our hospital staff, the statement added. The diocese later condemned the attack in the strongest possible terms and called on the international community to enforce Israel's adherence to the 4th Geneva Convention with respect to its provisions for special protections for hospitals and all of that. So, again, Israel, they're continuing the genocidal level of oppression in the Gaza Strip. They also have begun arming ISIS-affiliated gangs in southern Lebanon, specifically the gang affiliated with the anti-Hamas, again, ISIS-affiliated leader Abu Shabab. His gang has been operating in Israeli-controlled areas of southern Gaza and has been involved in looting aid shipments. Last year, an internal UN memo identified Abu Shabab's gang as the main and most influential stakeholder behind systematic and massive looting of aid trucks. Haaretz also reported last year that the Israeli military was allowing armed gangs to loot aid convoys and extort protection fees from drivers. In an interview with the Washington Post, Abu Shabab admitted that he and his group take from trucks, but claimed they didn't touch food, tents, or supplies for children. According to a report from the New Arab, Abu Shabab is affiliated with Shadi al-Sufi, another gang leader who was detained by Hamas in 2020 over an alleged murder. The report said al-Sufi fled Gaza with the help of ISIS and returned following the start of Israel's genocidal war. Abu Shabab was imprisoned by Hamas for drug trafficking before an Israeli airstrike allowed him to escape. Recently released video where he said his new armed group cleared eastern Rafah of Hamas fighters and said Palestinians should return to the area, which is under the control of the IDF. So, obviously, the first people to immediately start siding with the Jews in Gaza are going to be, the lowest of the low, the scum, the fellow rats, the looters, the druggies, the rapists. These type of characters are who's going to be doing this. But of course, Netanyahu, he isn't even necessarily denying this. A former defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, the leader of the Israeli opposition, he said Thursday that Prime Minister Netanyahu is arming gangs in South Gaza affiliated with ISIS. He said the Israeli government is giving weapons to a group of criminals and felons identified as the Islamic State at the direction of the Prime Minister. An initial statement released by Netanyahu's office didn't deny the allegations, said Israel is acting to defeat Hamas in various and diverse ways upon the recommendation of all heads of the security establishment. So, again, it's clear that if this is what they're willing to admit to, who knows what other shady, suspicious nonsense is going on in Gaza. I'm talking, potential organ trafficking, child trafficking, who knows what the Israelis are doing to some of these people that they have captured. I mean, we know they enjoy sodomizing people they imprison in military prisons, so I can only imagine what they're willing to do and their connection to, criminal networks and markets around the world that, again, I've always been sure that the Jewish element has been the most important there. But you mentioned earlier, Dimitri, the big news as well with this aid flotilla that Greta Thunberg, our favorite, climate change activist, is operating from Sicily all the way to Gaza. Obviously, the IDF is not going to let them dock on the shores of Gaza. Even more than that, they are freaking out. They have sent drones. I believe that the ship had just entered Greek territorial waters, and the IDF and Israeli forces had already had drones operating and watching the flotilla, watching, these boats. Lindsey Graham is tweeting out that he hopes they're good at swimming, implying that he wants, again, Greta Thunberg, say what you will about her, but she's a young girl. There's other people with them. These are obviously people that aren't going to engage in any kind of military activity. But we have U.S. senators openly saying the Israelis should bomb them out of the water, sink them. But unfortunately for their cause, leftists, they can never just, there'll be a cause that kind of unites certain elements of left and right, and they always have to mess it up. They apparently, for a few hours or days, diverted course from Gaza to pick up 6 boat people, 6 rape refugees in the water of the Mediterranean coming from Libya or something that had, their boat had sunk and they were going to pick them up. So that's a great idea. Pick up 6, starved Muslim Africans to be on this boat with you and a bunch of female activists. That sounds like a great idea. But Brigadier General Effie Edfrin, he said the IDF is prepared to operate on all fronts, including the maritime arena. We have gained experience in many years. He talked about this was in response to being asked about this vessel. So obviously the IDF does have a contingency plan to literally just bomb this boat of civilian aid. But I'm not sure why they think that I'm not sure what they think this is going to get them in the optics war between how else they act with all the aid. But I don't know, maybe they think that enough the same boomers that watch Fox News and support them hate Greta Thunberg so much that it won't really matter, which, maybe they're right. That could easily be the case. But I think in general, the situation in Palestine, Trump, while he may not be willing to get us to war with Iran, which I think is going to happen anyway, whether he likes it or not, he clearly is willing to let pretty much every other front in Greater Israel's expansionist, multi-directional, multi-front war go forward pretty much uninterrupted. Obviously, we know the West Bank was purchased by Miriam Adelson, and it's clear that at this point, Gaza Trump has not spoken out against the Israeli plans to deport all these people. Trump is also supporting, recognition of Somaliland. It seems that this war in Libya is going to be wrapping up soon as Egypt, Turkey, Russia, the US, France all seem to be on the same side now behind General Haftar. These Palestinians are likely going to be dispersed across Africa, as far as I can tell, and Trump is clearly going to be supporting that. Trump obviously is somewhat supportive of the new Syrian government, but he has in no way condemned Israel's actions there. So as of now, Trump seems to be supportive of all of the directions in which Israel is gaining new territory. So, that's that. And unfortunately for, the axis of resistance, like we mentioned earlier with the Lebanon strikes, Hezbollah seems to be completely impotent now. There was some group in Syria that launched a strike that was immediately responded to. It's clear that any of these Iranian-backed groups, whether they're in Iraq or elsewhere, aren't able to do much. The Houthis, again, the only ones that are still doing things. They are still launching attacks at Tel Aviv, at other parts of Israel that are, having to force Israel to scramble its air defenses, which I'm sure the Iranians are always taking note of. So the Houthis are always still contributing to the resistance effort. But the other big player, being Turkey, they, again, don't seem willing to, at any level similar to Iran, actually stand up to Israel for what they're doing to the Palestinians. And we've recently heard that Turkey is purchasing the least amount of Russian fossil fuels in 3 years. We also know that the Istanbul negotiations that recently occurred there between Russia and Ukraine, clearly, those are not going to lead to anything, as Putin, even Trump recently said that he thinks Russia and Ukraine should fight it out for a little bit. Putin says he doesn't see a ceasefire as productive. And I think ultimately Turkey would be still interested in seeing Iran, eliminated in some capacity as a regional competitor. I think they would, again, with their Azerbaijani allies, I think they'd see them and Israel could perhaps share the region in some capacity, even though obviously I think Israel would be baiting them with that as well. But unless you have any final news about, Turkey, Syria, the Levant, Palestine, what's going on there, Dimitri, it is time to probably discuss Russia, Ukraine.
I guess the final bit of news, which I'll mention, and this could be read on our World War Now Telegram. We've posted it. Just simply type in Syria into the search bar. When you look at our World War Now channel, you'll find this particular story. Essentially, Trump has issued an official proposal for the Syrian government, essentially stating that they'll receive all kinds of financial support from Trump's ally, Saudi Arabia, and all kinds of $500 million of frozen assets from Europe. Very interesting, by the way. It kind of mirrors perhaps an agreement that later in the future, Europe, NATO, the EU, and the US may sign with Russia, unfreezing $300+ billion of their assets as well. So notice the first unfreezing of assets for a country which has been sanctioned has taken place or will take place if Syria agrees to this. But Syria will need to break any alliances they have with any Palestinian activists and also ban them, right? So again, notice America, it doesn't really care about jihadis, Al-Qaeda. It cares primarily about Hamas and sort of any Palestinian-aligned Islamic organizations. And yeah, all kinds of other interesting points about chemical weapons related to Bashar al-Assad, most likely just to forge all kinds of long-term stories and histories for the Syrian government, and form a professional army. So disband some of these foreign fighting legions from Central Asia, which I think is a sensible proposal. These people are quite dangerous. They're literally, as you said, Conrad, the low of the low in Palestine, Gaza. These are like the low lives from Central Asia who travel to Syria in order to fight the holy Islamic war of shahids and jihadis. So overall, this proposal by Trump essentially is aimed at Iran because the point 8, he says, prevent Iran's entrenchment and designating the Revolutionary Guards of Iran, which is one of Iran's main military wings, as a terrorist organization. So the IRGC, which again points to the fact that Trump does want Syria as at least a regional ally in this future war against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Very interesting. And, this completely sort of justifies all of our fears that we've been speaking about recently. And moving on to Russia, Ukraine, and I guess we'll kind of just discuss briefly the conversation that Donald J. Trump had with President Putin, the second conversation that he's had in recent months, very important, 75-minute phone call, 1 hour and 15 minutes. They spoke about the terror strike against Russian airports, the strike against the trains, which at this point we can already confirm, initially given the train lines themselves were adequate targets, but the Ukrainians, they made sure, and Arestowicz even pointed this out, Alexei Arestowicz, Zelensky's former cabinet assistant and advisor, he pointed out that the Ukrainians, they actually made sure to make these explosions textbook terror strikes. They could have blown the bridges up and blown the railways up without any trains going over them. But they waited until a civilian train was passing by, and then they blew it up. Arestowicz said there was no point in rushing the operation. You can simply send an encrypted message or either via the internet or some other means and just simply delay the explosion itself, right? Via an order from Kiev or some other officers of the SBU. But no, they wanted to kill Russian civilians in the Kursk and Bryansk Oblast, and that's exactly what the Ukrainians did. So yeah, despite the fact that these railways and literally bridges over these rivers in the Sumskaya Oblast and Kursk Bryanskaya Oblast are natural military targets in a state of war, even during the SMO, the Ukrainians, they want to sort of enrich some of their actions with war crimes. So that's, the status quo, I think. So naturally, this is what's taking place. So President Trump and Putin spoke about one other very important thing, besides all this amicable rhetoric about how Russia and Ukraine need to work towards a peace. They mentioned Iran specifically, and President Trump told Putin that essentially Iran is running out of time to reach a deal, and Iran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Again, like as if President Putin is a complete idiot. Like Russia is sending through Rosatom, they are sending scientists and specialists to help Iran probably enrich their uranium, because Russia is the world leading export at uranium enrichment. Does Trump think Putin doesn't know if Iran is or is not working towards a nuclear weapon? Because Russia 100% would be made aware of that ahead of time. Iran is Russia's military ally at this point. So it's almost as if Trump is pretending Putin is a child, or it's disrespectful at this point. And President Putin simply suggested that he's going to have some conversations with Iran, and maybe there'll be some helpful discussions that could lead to a rapid conclusion. But again, I think we have our doubts about that. I think Iran at the moment is really trying to reach its own personal goals, sovereignty-wise, as is Russia and Ukraine. Notice, remember, Xi Jinping even tried to pressure Russia into signing a peace treaty with Ukraine somewhat prematurely, even before the Kursk operation took place. But Russia is just not bending, so I don't expect Iran to bend to Russian pressure either. And, in relation to the news, right, the bombing of the airfields, the destruction of Russian Air Force war assets, Ukrainians have released very clear sort of HD footage. Again, true, this footage can be doctored. I think we have to sort of start off with that assumption. The well can be poisoned, the well of information from which we sort of drink some of our facts and consume our knowledge. But some of the footage that Ukraine has released show at least 10, maybe on paper, how many? So 16, 17 aircraft that have been hit by drones. which may lead us to believe in some of the channels which we've been reading on Telegram. And then these are not pro-Ukrainian channels by any stretch, but we can speculate that allegedly Ukraine, we have to use our wording very carefully here, not to breach any Russian state laws, but maybe Ukraine did destroy more than simply 3 or 4 bomber planes, because it does show that more than 3 or 4 planes were hit by these explosive suicide drones that we talked about last week. So we just have to keep in mind these are 9 Tu-95 bombers allegedly were just destroyed or very heavily damaged, 5 Tu-22 bombers, 1 AN-12 transport plane, and 1 A-50 AWACS plane as well. So the Ukrainians have this Operation Pautina, Operation Web, has been generally seen as a success. I know there's a lot of cope. And the Ukrainians have, again, they have killed civilians in this process. But I think labeling this as a terror strike, and this is what the Russian spokesperson of the Duma has made this quite clear, and Klishas, all kinds of Russian cabinet members have already spoken out and said this is a terror strike. I think Ukrainians simply, whenever they carry out these attempted operations on Russian territory, it's just part of their repertoire that they kill civilians. Some of the curious facts surrounding this operation is that it's been made clear who was the man that hired the actual trucks, which were, again, into which these drones were installed and which had all these remote control operative technological addendums sort of attached into. They were ordered by a local former Ukrainian man from Donetsk, I believe, from the Donbass. So it really does exemplify the degree to which Ukraine has assets and even operatives working not just in eastern former Ukraine, for example, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, but the fact that Ukrainians can masquerade their dialect, their accents, and they can appear as Russians, right? It's Ukrainian spycraft is reaching levels of severity that, not only do they hire Russians to carry out terror strikes, the Ukrainians are almost, you cannot tell them apart from Russians physically as well as, by physiognomy or any other means, especially if they take on Russian accents. It's very hard. And Russia is somewhat flooded with migrants from Central Asia. So it's, there's more and more, shall we say, tolerance taking place. You can't really suspect someone to be of another ethnicity and sort of assume that they're working for the Ukrainian state. All kinds of complexities are taking place at the moment inside of Russia. And I'm sure the FSB is ever evolving in terms of their approaches to terrorism. But in terms of actual FSB activity, I think they should investigate one particular journalist we've spoken about quite a few times in a negative light, the most popular journalistic reporter and news station host, Vladimir Solovyov, aka Vladimir Shapiro, right? We don't really even need to mention his ethnicity, but there are great photos of him, of a wrapped around Tefillin, a black cube in his head, visiting the wall, etc. This is a charlatan of the highest degree, an absolute degenerate in terms of political rhetoric, and a snake, a shapeshifter. And he's recently spoken out because notice in Russia, Conrad, you cannot criticize the Russian government as to how they conduct a military operation. You cannot produce fake news reports about military operations. So these spokespersons, how do they comment on the recent airfield bombings? They cannot criticize the Russian government for not building, for example, defensive bays and defensive warehouses to hide this high-tech aircraft in. So instead, they simply criticize Ukraine first and foremost, but then they also criticize individual Russian soldiers. Vladimir Solovyov, on the first channel of Russia, so Russia 1, spoke out and accused the Russian soldier who was filming the entire event. This is just the Russian recruit. I believe he looks very young, maybe 18, 20, 21 years of age, very young, Zuma. He was filming the drones flying and attacking the planes. Vladimir Solovyov said that this particular soldier needs to be taken and shot in front of his entire battalion or brigade as a show, essentially marking him as a traitor. And nothing happened to Vladimir Solovyov. The general federal prosecutor of the Russian Federation did not arrest him. He wasn't charged. You cannot call for an execution and essentially murder of a Russian service person, of a Russian soldier. That is against the law in Russia. Igor Strelkov said the officers who were in charge of the Russian salaries at the beginning of the SMO needed to be executed. He said that in Telegram, and he's sitting in prison for those remarks now and still sitting out. He's still sitting, I think, for about 3 more years. Vladimir Solovyov Shapiro, due to his influence, his sycophancy before the Russian government, before United Russia in particular, and his Jewish ethnicity, his Talmudic connections, is immune. He can call for the death of a Russian soldier on live television, mainstream federal publicly owned channels. So this really shows who's in control of Russian media, or at least a large portion of it. Unfortunately, these particular people always call for agitation. They call for very bizarre escalations in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So we're just keeping this in mind as these various stories progress, that the Russian media is not necessarily owned by so-called truthful patriots. The first response by the Russian aerospace forces, so essentially the Russian Air Force, have taken place against Ukraine. And this is a clear retaliation for the airfield operation Web that the Ukrainians have undertaken. So the Russians launched 407 drones and at least 44 long-range missiles, including Iskanders, at Kiev, at Lutsk, at Lviv, and the Ternopil Oblast. These are far western Ukraine oblasts, and Kiev, of course, in the center of Ukraine. They destroyed energy infrastructure, all kinds of repair plants, thermal power plants, and naturally a lot of these factories, drone-producing plants. So the Russians have retaliated very strongly. Unfortunately, the way this was even headlined by Russia Today, RT, which I'm not a big fan of anymore. I was in the early 2010s, but they reported, they said, well, in retaliation to Ukraine's terror act, Russia bombed all of these Ukrainian military and energy targets. The strike should not have been carried out in response to a terror strike. You're in a state of special military operation, essentially a state of sacred war, as per Patriarch Kirill. You should be striking these targets irrespective of what Ukraine does. So again, Russia Today, whoever the publishers are of these news stories, really don't know how to title their report releases. And again, it just creates a schizophrenic image of Russia always being this reactionary power, which has no particular agency of their own. They're simply reacting to Ukrainian terror strikes, and as if Russia is not trying to reach a particular goal in Ukraine, which they clearly are. They're trying to demilitarize and at least denazify the Ukrainian state, which again is a controversial in and of itself. But it does appear that NATO has officially announced plans to catch up with Russian ammunition production, in particular Russian shell production for Russian artillery, which Russians have been outproducing all of NATO. So on paper, Russia produces 3 months worth. So on paper, what NATO produces in 1 year, and this is all of NATO combined, including America, Russia produces in 3 months. So in a quarter of the time. So the Russian military-industrial complex is right now pumping at full blast. They are producing all kinds of military equipment, especially artillery shells. There will not be a shortage anytime soon. And NATO has made it clear that they need to catch up to that. And we, of course, bearing in mind what the military capacity is of, Europe is a heavily industrialized country. If it does step up its game, I think it can most likely catch up to those numbers, at least to some extent. But again, the European people are not just lazy. Unfortunately, they've been subjugated to consumerism, materialism. I think they're very averse to war, and especially they're averse to, and maybe this is a good thing in the end, and there'll be less inclination by the globalists to lead Europe into another fight against Russia, as they have historically been doing for the last 5+ centuries. So maybe this is a positive change. Russia has been making significant advances in the Sumskaya Oblast, despite the destruction of the bridges and the railways. Russia has been taking villages leading up to some of the main highways and freeways which lead to the city of Sumy itself. We note that the Metropolitan of Sumy, Yevlogius, is one of the confessors of the faith. So as soon as the Sumskaya Oblast is liberated, in particular if Sumy itself is maybe temporarily occupied or liberated by Russia, then the persecution of the church will essentially cease in this particular area, and Metropolitan Yevlogius can finally be free to give sermons which aren't politically sensitive. So this is, of course, a great development. And the Ukrainians are trying to stop this by firing HIMARS, killing Russian troops as they're advancing. But again, HIMARS only hit primarily stationary targets, that you can't really hit moving targets. So as long as the Russians keep agile, remain dynamic in how they transport troops and vehicles from village to village, the Ukrainians will find it a lot harder to lock them down. That's why they use that combination of long-range HIMARS plus drone strike. The drones lock the Russians down, and then the HIMARS strike atop of them. So it's very interesting. But on all the other fronts, Russia does seem to essentially make incremental moves. Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Kherson, of course, incredibly stationary. Stationary fights in Zaporozhye, no real progression there. The Russians are still fighting off Ukrainian, ever-increasing waves of recruits. I think some of these reports that the Ukrainian military is on the brink of collapse are a little bit premature, as I've said. I think Ukraine at this point, given recent developments in Trump's rhetoric in terms of accusing Russia of not playing nice in terms of these peace talks. It does give Ukraine some fuel. So Ukraine can almost say for sure that Trump will not surrender Ukrainian interest and that he'll be supporting them. And this, of course, is a huge boost to their morale. An interesting bit of news from the Ukrainian high command is that they've actually included a new commander to their ranks. And this is a 49-year-old. So this is considered, I guess, in terms of generals, one of the youngest generals of the entire Russo-Ukrainian war, a man named Robert Brovdi. And his nickname is Magyar. So I guess his nickname is Hungarian. I'm not sure if he's Hungarian ethnically speaking, but at least he's now been appointed the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces drone systems. So he's in charge of all of the drone attacks of Ukraine. And this man, if you look at his sort of short resume that we have available to us, he's only been active in warfare. He was a businessman and he was specializing in tech, and he only became involved in warfare in 2022. So he's, since the age of 46, he's been involved in war, and now he's probably the youngest military commander we have in the world that's risen up the ranks with such speed. And he's actively, of course, probably coordinating a lot of these Ukrainian drone strikes and, strategizing about how exactly Ukraine should be hitting the Russians. And that's, we have to keep in mind, generally speaking, no pun intended, but the Ukrainian generals and commanders are 20 years younger than their Russian counterparts. And this mirrors exactly how World War II, the outline of World War II, when the German field marshals and generals were about 20 years older than the Russian field marshals, such as Rokossovsky, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, etc. So very interesting how the Ukrainians have a very dynamic leadership. They're ever increased. So there's clear competition among the Ukrainians as to who can lead the most effectively. And of course, there's the financing from the West is assisting in that. But in terms of Russian generals, we don't know many of them by name. Of course, there's Mordashov, Ivanov, etc. But the Russians don't seem to be propagandizing or using the names of their generals in PR instances. It's almost like they're afraid to bring some of these officers into the limelight, most likely because of the potential political aspirations which may arise after the special military operation. Some of these generals, just like General Lebedev or some of these generals rising to prominence after the Chechen campaigns, and they essentially become politicians. So I think there's an inherent fear within Russia. And the last sort of short bit of news, Conrad, that I'll need to mention is that the private military company Wagner has officially ceased their operations. The private military company of Wagner has officially ceased their operations in Mali, in Africa, which is very interesting because so officially Wagner, as a massive company and Russian paramilitary group, is not actively involved in any country at the moment, including Ukraine. And this begs the question as to where will Wagner go next under its new leadership without Prigozhin, without Dmitry Utkin? Will they all head back to Belarus to be training Belarusian military? Will they join the Russians again in Ukraine? So very interesting developments. We'll make sure to keep an eye out on exactly how that goes forward. So the Russo-Ukrainian war, ever evolving, lots of news politically and internally on almost every single front. And all of this takes place as Andrei Yermak, the right-hand man of Zelensky, a Talmudic Zionist, a Kabbalist, visits the White House and essentially states openly to the White House Trump administration that Russia's aims are to capture 50% of Ukraine at the very least, including the city of Kiev and the city of Odessa. So Andrei Yermak travels to the White House, to Washington, D.C., to essentially prevent this hawkish plan by the Russian Federation, these allegations, which Russia, yes, there's been politicians that have called for the taking of more territories beyond the 4 constitutional oblasts, but we haven't seen that in practice. And yet the Ukrainians, I think, have some sort of foreknowledge or some sort of demonic clairvoyance in which they see that the Russians have very far-reaching aspirations. And I hope they're actually correct, because then that would justify the loss of life and some of the other atrocities that have taken place, including the persecution of the church in Ukraine. At least this massive SMO was not for nothing in the end.
That was a pretty comprehensive report. I agree. I mean, now that we've seen the Russians in their demands in Istanbul say that, the protection and the freedom and the restoration of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to its proper place is one of their demands. I mean, I think we can in many ways call this a war that is being fought for, in that regard, for the correct Christian reasons. And you mentioned the recent big strikes that are supposedly, I guess, perhaps in response to the train attacks. I guess we probably haven't seen the full response to
Hmm.
the big Operation Spiderweb quite yet. Putin said those are going to hit. Trump himself, after the phone call, said that, they're going to be hard to deal with, but that they have to happen. And I think, like Jim Jatra said on my recent show with him and Jason Moranchuk, the real question is why isn't Russia striking SBU headquarters? Why isn't Russia striking some of the real decision-making centers in Kiev? Why isn't Russia striking, or at least striking near, some of the places where these NATO operators are? It's clear that Russia still just has so many of these rules that they aren't publicly broadcasting, that they are still just clearly abiding by. And I don't know if they have any kind of communication with these Ukrainians and these Westerners that are making sure they know exactly where not to strike and where, what needs to happen. But it's clear that the Russians have this pathological fear of escalating things in the eyes of the West. But again, all of this comes, the real question being, you mentioned Andrei Yermak, showing his map where, 50%, 50 plus percent of Ukraine by 2026 is occupied by Russia.
Hmm.
He said that, regarding his visit, that they plan to talk about defense support and the situation on the battlefield, strengthening sanctions against Russia. Trump recently asked Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal regarding their bill that they're proposing for massive increases on Russian sanctions. He, I think, still supports having some bill on the table to use to threaten Russia with, but he wants them to taper down on the sanctions, reduce the severity a little bit. And this comes again amidst his meeting with Friedrich Merz of Germany, which was overshadowed by the huge Donald Trump, Elon Musk crash out breakup situation, which I'm going to discuss here momentarily. But the meeting with Merz and Trump, did talk a lot about Ukraine. And I think the headline regarding that was where Trump said, this meeting was on Thursday, of course. He suggested that Russia and Ukraine should maybe fight for a little while, as the recent efforts for a peace deal appear to be making little progress. Trump made the comments to reporters in the Oval Office while hosting German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and compared the war in Ukraine to a fight between children. Sometimes you see two young children fighting like crazy. He said they hate each other and they're fighting in a park, and you try to pull them apart. They don't want to be pulled. Sometimes you're better off letting them fight for a while and then pulling them apart. Trump said he made the analogy in his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin this week. I said, President, maybe you're going to have to keep fighting and suffering a lot. Maybe both sides are suffering before you pull them apart because they're able to be pulled apart. Before they're able to be pulled apart, he said. After the call with Putin on Wednesday, Trump said that Russian leader told him Moscow would have to respond to Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian airfields and said there would likely not be immediate peace. In his remarks on Thursday, Trump suggested he could sanction both Russia and Ukraine if a peace deal isn't reached. When I see the moment where it's not going to stop, it will be very, very tough, he said, and it can be on both countries, to be honest. It takes two to tango. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been demanding new U.S. sanctions on Russia and made the call again on Thursday. We do count on strong steps. That's what's in short supply right now, and this is what can make even the sleazebags in Moscow realize they can't pull the war off, wrote Zelensky on X. This is why we need new and sufficient sanctions, first and foremost from the United States. This is why we need clear political pressure for diplomacy to be effective. In the meantime, the U.S. continues to provide military aid and intelligence support to Ukraine to fuel the proxy war. Ukraine has been stepping up attacks on Russian territory, which always risks a major escalation. So Trump, again, clearly is interested in ceding territory to the Russians. I don't think he's interested in ceding as much territory as the Russians demanded in their agreement. But unfortunately, I think within a few more months of Russian territorial gains, I think he will warm up to that idea. But by the time that happens, I mean, who knows if the Russians will even be, still interested in moving forward with that proposal. We are hearing about reports, you mentioned, Dmitry, of Sumy, Liman, Southern Donetsk axes, where the Russians are advancing on the ground across all these areas. Apparently, entire Ukrainian brigades since the beginning of June have been forced to withdraw or risk encirclement. But again, we also need to remember that cities like Izium and others are still very far off, and those were at one point under Russian control after the beginning of the SMO and were retaken by the Ukrainians in their counteroffensive. So we need to keep all this in perspective here, as a lot of work is needed to be done to still restore this thing to the sort of civilizationally important, I think, at least to the level and the success level and the dedication with which this civilizationally important battle is being fought. There's still kind of a long way to go. But obviously, besides the Russia-Ukraine stuff, whatever was going on with Friedrich Merz and Trump was completely overshadowed by the fact that during that meeting, Trump, he called out Elon Musk. He says, Elon Musk, he couldn't handle it, all this kind of stuff. And Elon Musk is meanwhile implying that Trump is a pedophile and was involved in the Epstein situation. And that's why the Epstein files didn't come out, because Trump is implicated in them. Trump's now talking about he's going to sell his Tesla that Elon gave him. They're totally crashing out on each other. Apparently, they had a phone call to try to reconcile it. But, this is a pretty big deal because, Elon, his days at Doge recently expired because he wasn't able to be a permanent, government employee because he needed Senate approval. So that's all expired. He is now, no longer working in the administration. He, again, was pretty much Trump's biggest donor. He himself also gave almost $300 million to the Trump campaign through his America PAC. And ultimately, the reason for this crash out, of course, is this big, beautiful bill, as it's being called. That is actually the official name. So calling it that isn't just a Trumpism. That's what it's being called. And while obviously there's some things in the bill that I completely disagree with, and I'm going to talk about in a second, Elon's criticism here is quite cynical. There's supposed to be electric vehicle mandates and tax credits and all sorts of things in there. That didn't work out. Recently, Trump rejected, I think it was Jacob or Jared Isaacson, who was an Elon Musk ally who was supposed to become the head of NASA. And then apparently Starlink and SpaceX were not picked up for multiple huge government contracts. So Elon Musk is very disappointed that he wasn't able to buy, I think, as much business success as he wanted with his massive contributions to the Trump campaign. But Elon Musk has, claimed to come out against these claims that it's all about the fiscal responsibility. It's all about wanting to cut the pork and the deficit because this is going to dramatically increase the debt and the deficit and all sorts of things. Because, again, remember, the legislative branch is completely impotent. They can only pass these massive budget reconciliation bills, these omnibus spending bills. They can't actually just pass legislations and laws and balance the budget accordingly. That's not how these things work because of politics. Nobody wants to challenge military or entitlement spending. So the best we got was Doge cutting things like scientific research and, other fairly small, relatively speaking, government endeavors. But I guess the problems that we could be discussing when it comes to the big, beautiful bill are these interesting clauses that talk about funding for technology and AI systems, as well as the restriction on states restricting artificial intelligence outside, again, mandating it only the federal government basically have jurisdiction in that regard. And the reason this is terrifying is because I recently, in the past few weeks, we've been talking about the Palantir database, the consolidation of all of these federal databases, all this information, medical, bio data, all sorts of health data, criminal records, credit scores, college scores, school, all sorts of kind of stuff into one big Palantir database. And again, if then local states aren't going to be able to regulate it, then it's totally controlled from the, top down from the federal government side of things. Then we start to see other terrifying headlines like GOP rep introduces resolution labeling Free Palestine slogan as anti-Semitism. Colorado GOP Congressman Gabe Evans introduced a non-binding resolution on Friday that labels Free Palestine as an anti-Semitic slogan. The bill seeks to limit immigration of people who oppose Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine and Tel Aviv's genocidal onslaught, besieged Gaza Strip. The bill is expected to be voted on sometime next week. The bill reads, whereas while shouting Free Palestine, an anti-Semitic slogan that calls for the destruction of the state of Israel and Jewish people, Mohammed Sabri Soliman attacked the peaceful demonstrators with homemade Molotov cocktails. So, of course, referencing that recent, terrorist attack in Boulder, Colorado by that Mohammed Soliman, Egyptian national, who is, attacking some Jews or something who were demonstrating in favor of Israel. But between this and the other laws that are effectively trying to make anti-Semitism completely illegal, ban people from coming into the country or studying in the country for being pro-Palestinian, just in general, turning America more like Europe and just like Israel in general with, getting to a Noahide law level of oppression for those that want to speak up against Jewish power. If this database is being built, who we know by Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, who is a left-wing Zionist, insane nationalist who his biggest fear is the Christian right coming to power and throwing him out of a window because he's Jewish. What do you think this database is going to be used for? It's going to be used for finding and persecuting the people who, look, obviously they're going after people to say Free Palestine. What do you think they're going to do to the average World War Now listener? It's not going to be good. So I think, people listening to the show, this is some of the most relevant stuff as far as our analysis is concerned, because, who knows how much Donald Trump even knows about this, but, Peter Thiel, he's secured the vice president, his net worth has gone up to $22 billion in the past 3 years. His company, Palantir, with this foundry technology, they are, leading in government contracts and implementation across the Western world in Israel with leading military tech, you know, integrations that are happening right now. They are at the forefront regarding AI, regarding, information warfare, regarding, they are literally making drone strike lists for Gazans and other enemies of Israel already. So they basically want to bring this, home domestically. Whitney Webb has talked about this a lot. Obviously, Nick Fuentes is talking about this. And I think it's going to grow to be, as is already and is going to continue to grow to be one of the most important ongoing stories that really merge, obviously, the expansion of Greater Israel and the sort of ongoing triumph of world Jewry abroad with the domestic battle, the current lurch towards, total panopticon authoritarian Zog state here in the United States. So we're obviously going to keep our ears to the ground regarding that unfortunate development that it appears Trump has no interest in even publicly acknowledging at all. But the only other things going on here in the States that are really relevant, obviously, Trump is going to be negotiating with Xi Jinping on June 9th in London, or rather, some American delegations will on trade. Supposedly, big trade deals are coming down the pike here. And, China has been tweeting out, obviously, against the United States that they shouldn't press the Taiwan issue, that there could be good relations between the countries regarding trade and these sorts of things, but that, China has red lines and they are going to respond to any Western incursions into the South China Sea, as well as, economic incursions on their trade blocks. They're going to respond to that in kind. So again, I think a lot of people in the State Department, a lot of people in the Pentagon, a lot of people in the White House, they really want to move on from this Russia-Ukraine stuff and this Iran, Israel, Middle East stuff and really focus on China. But I think Israel, the Jews, I think they're very aware of that as well, and they're doing everything they can to, different Jews, I think different factions of world Jewry are working to keep Trump and the U.S.'s money, eyes, and military might and aid situation focused on those two regions in particular, because they are of more interests to our small hat wearing friends. But moving quickly to Africa, before we talk about a few other small things like Vucic's comments, what's going on in India, Pakistan, and then a brief comment about Thailand and Cambodia. This is from Middle East Eye. It says Greece to lobby Egypt against Haftar endorsing Turkey-Libya maritime deal. Greece is expected to ask Egypt to intervene to dissuade the government in eastern Libya backed by General Khalifa Haftar from ratifying a maritime agreement with Turkey, Middle Eastern Eye can reveal. Greek Foreign Minister George Gerapatridis is expected to raise the issue with his Egyptian counterpart on Wednesday. Two regional officials with knowledge of the matter told MEE. Libya's internationally recognized government in Tripoli signed a contentious maritime demarcation agreement with Turkey in 2019 that ignored Greece's claims to exclusive economic zones, including major Greek islands like Crete and Rhodes. So remember, Turkey for the longest time supported the Tripoli government that is still in power there, but have recently decided to join up with everyone else. Greece obviously was also a supporter of Haftar back in the day as an ally of Egypt. Greece countered that maritime agreement the next year by signing its own deal with Egypt. Haftar-controlled eastern Libya has opposed Turkey's ambitions for years and backed Cairo along with the UAE. Any move by eastern Libya to endorse Turkey's position would represent a sea change for the eastern Mediterranean, where regional actors hope to develop potentially lucrative natural gas deposits. It would be a major boost for Ankara's bid to assert itself as the dominant maritime power in the region, as would it put all of Libya's factions in line with Turkey's claims. If the deal is pursued, it could reawaken maritime tensions in the region, which saw Greece and Turkey edge close to conflict in the summer of 2020. Greece and Cyprus are already alarmed, but any recognition of Turkey's maritime claims could also irk Israel. Greece, Cyprus, and Israel want to develop gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean and build a subsea electrical interconnector, but those projects have stalled. So the big news about this also is, of course, Sam Paisios' prophecies about maritime borders and whatnot come into play. Turkey moving these maritime borders, the exclusive economic zone, these sorts of things factor into when, Turkey will make a move on certain Greek islands like Crete and others that will, I think, come under a very short form of kinetic conflict. But the big news out of Libya, of course, is that it seems that everyone pretty much involved is coalescing behind Haftar. I'm assuming in some capacity the Turks are also still supporting the Tripoli government, but it seems inevitable at this point that Libya might be reunited under a single government that is supported by Egypt, Russia, Turkey, France, the United States, which, that would be a very big development indeed. Of course, The war in Congo is still dramatically escalating. M23 has called back their negotiators from Doha, Qatar, that were, negotiating on their behalf. They have now almost surrounded the city of Pingu from like four directions. They continue to advance fairly rapidly. So, despite the big mineral deal, despite the supposed peace agreement that Trump got signed, it appears that that was all for naught. So that's what's going on, of course, in the Congo. I don't know what needs to happen for that to stop. I don't know how in control Rwanda really is of M23, but clearly, if they are, they do not want this war to end. There have been more updates from Somaliland with AFRICOM, the first AFRICOM visit in a long time to happen in Somaliland, which coalesces with the Libya situation, that Libya, if it seems to be settling down and if Somaliland seems to be coming into existence, these are two of the primary locations that the Palestinians are very likely to be sent to, unfortunately. And with the United States recently vetoing the latest call for a Gaza ceasefire, the United Nations, it's clear that the U.S. is perhaps using its African influence in these parts of the world, even its diplomacy with states like Turkey and Russia, to create the necessary environment for these places where the local authorities will take in large numbers of Palestinian refugees sent to them by Israel in the form of, ethnic cleansing and genocide. And, speaking of attempted ethnic cleansing and genocide, recently the heads of Indian military and even Modi have hinted that Operation Sindoor that they launched on Pakistan is not over. And Modi has been really using their strikes on Pakistan to increase nationalist fervor in his rallies. This is from Indian source. Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Friday said that terrorist camps in Pakistan and Kashmir were reduced to rubble in strikes launched by India in Operation Sindoor in the aftermath of the Pahalgam terror attack. The Prime Minister also said that Pakistan orchestrated the May 22nd Pahalgam attack to incite riots in India. In his first visit to Jammu and Kashmir since the May 22nd Pahalgam attack, the Prime Minister said Pakistan is against humanity and even the livelihood of the poor.
Wow.
They continue to completely directly accuse the Pakistanis of directly operating the major terror attack that led to Operation Sindoor. And again, these hints that Operation Sindoor isn't over and that what we have right now is just a temporary halt and a temporary break in hostilities is clear that in some capacity, India and Pakistan do still consider themselves at war. So we're going to have to keep watching all of that very closely. There was, of course, a few skirmishes on the Thai-Cambodian border, which, again, they've had an ongoing conflict for a fairly extended period of time, but there was basically maps that have been issued in the past, few decades that showed territory that Thailand contests that Cambodia supposedly controls, and every once in a while there are flare-ups there. So we can watch that closely as well. I only bring it up because it shows you that so many parts of the world with conflicts that people aren't even aware of are coming into conflict because of every single country has proxies. Every single country has allegiances to some of the great powers that are going on. And any number of these pressure points can be exploited to disrupt supply lines, to, lead to future black swan events, or just in general to increase chaos around the world. And that is what a third world war would look like. So before we switch to church news, do you have any comments and any other news around the world on these fronts? Dmitry, I know Vucic had some comments and whatnot. So any other stories?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. Just some of these smaller stories, which we would be, of course, mistaken not to bring up here. President Vucic of Serbia has made it clear, obviously, this is probably in relation to Bosnia-Herzegovina, Republika Srpska, those aspirations, including Kosovo. So we understand when Serbians try to align against their, let's just say, Islamic enemies, geopolitically in the Balkans, they typically like to throw out some philo-Semitic statements, and President Vucic has clearly made it known. Again, the Kuk of Kosovo, he has reinforced his title here by stating, "I am the only one in Europe who trades military ammunition with Israel. If someone asks me about Bibi," that is the Prime Minister of Israel, "I will always say positive things." Yeah, so this is apparently an Orthodox Christian. So I don't think any comments are required here. It's just Vucic, as many patriotic right-wing Serbians have already made it clear to us in many of our comments and feedback on our Discord and elsewhere on Telegram, President Vucic is not representative of the Serbian people and some of their views. He's simply using that anti-Islamic animosity in order to score points with, I think, the global Talmudic cabal, frankly, and probably others. Who knows? Exactly, maybe the people who fund him and his campaign. This is considering that Serbia has less than 2,000 Jews residing therein. So it's not a minority that really he should be dependent upon in any capacity. And some of the other smaller stories, very interesting ones. So, of course, Sergei Shoigu, the former Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, has visited North Korea on another occasion. He's been visiting North Korea quite a bit, but he met up with Kim Jong-un and said that essentially, of course, they shook hands, some pretty interesting photo ops they had. And of course, Comrade Kim has reinforced his position and stated that North Korea will unconditionally support Russia's war against Ukraine. I mean, most likely, I don't know if the South Korean language even has the terminology special military operation, but I think that's what he meant, because Sergei Shoigu didn't really comment on the war, on the state of the war, even though President Putin has called it a war at least on one occasion in the last 3 years. In any case, I think Russia can depend on North Korea as one of its own most reliable allies. Mind you, for any listeners, we most likely believe that all the assistance that North Korea has been providing the Russian Federation thus far has been with the express blessing of the People's Republic of China. Just keeping that in mind, because China has been trading not just commercially with the US and many of the enemies that have been funding Ukraine throughout the conflict. We know China most definitely has been selling drone parts to Ukraine almost directly. And yes, China does, of course, assist Pakistan and Iran and other nations. China is essentially just making bank from basically every single warring party around the world at the moment. Of course, beyond getting involved in a conflict itself with either the Philippines or Taiwan, but I guess that will develop further probably as we read these news stories throughout the next coming weeks. There's been some interesting developments again on the Russo-Ukrainian, and I do need to mention this kind of ties into some of our massive church news that we'll discuss towards the end of the episode and the statement of Rokor. But Ukraine has struck, again, multiple Russian regions, in particular civilian targets, over 13 different oblasts, including the Saratovskaya Oblast, in particular the city of Engels. Now you may ask, why is there a city named Engels, named after Friedrich Engels, one of the founders of communism alongside Karl Marx, in Saratov, which is where essentially it's so far east, or so distant. It's on the southern Volga, where the Volga falls into the Caspian Sea on the border of Kazakhstan. A Ukrainian drone flew all the way there, only to smash into a civilian residential apartment building. So again, terrorism, but also it points out that, look, Russia still has many of these oblasts here, many of the cities, railways, public monuments still named after essentially Russophobes, anti-Christian philosophers, all kinds of questionable characters. I just have to recall that Father John, Saint John Vostorgov, one of the new martyrs, expressly called not just Karl Marx, but Friedrich Engels a spiritual Jew, which I think he was correct in doing so. Saint John prayed to us and prayed for the Russian state to enlighten them to change some of these essentially cursed names of cities and oblasts, which I think are a stain upon the Russian people. Just for reference, Engels used to be called Pokrovsk, named after the Pokrov Bogorodice, the protection of the Theotokos. So, what a great name change we have here. But this is, as many cases in Ukraine and Russia that, still things that need to fall in line for Russia to really come out of its spiritual hibernation. I need to mention Putin's remarks in relation to the recent peace talks, as well as Ukraine's terror attacks against Russian military and civilian targets. President Putin essentially made it very clear that Ukraine at the moment is suffering huge losses. It's retreating across the entire front line, which we agree. And so he called this an act of desperation. He said that Ukraine essentially forces mobilization, and he's surprised that Kyiv refused to at least have a 2 or 3 day humanitarian ceasefire, which Russia proposed. I think we're surprised by that too. It seems like Zelensky relies on this wartime regime so heavily that even 2 or 3 days of peace may throw his presidency into question, especially with so many predatory politicians aiming to maybe take him out internally speaking, as well as maybe even military officers who question his, shall we say, resolve as the leader of Ukraine, given his drug addictions and other negative factors, personally speaking. And President Putin just made it very clear that Kyiv, Ukraine, is turning into accomplices and sponsors of terrorism. And President Putin made the remark at the end of his small monologue. He said, who even negotiates with terrorists? And I have to say, unfortunately, the Russian Federation negotiates with terrorists. They made it quite clear with HTS, the regime in Syria. We can even comment on the Taliban, recent normalizations with Afghanistan. And these are former mujahideen who, again, have killed Russians during the Soviet-Afghanistan war. And so unfortunately, the Russian Federation is forced maybe and I'm not even going to mention the Chechen wars, right? Ahmad Kadyrov, etc. These are former terrorists. Russia is forced to negotiate with terrorists. President Putin's question was somewhat rhetorical. And it's simply the case at the moment that almost every nation fighting in this warm phase of the Third World War needs to engage with some of these terroristic factions in order to at least normalize relations to some extent, which is very unfortunate, the state that we're in at the moment. And this is groundbreaking news, frankly. I think, Conrad, you would agree. Maybe even the biggest news story of the week, although it's basically not made headlines. And that is that Kazakhstan and Great Britain have signed a military cooperation agreement. So Kazakh ministers have visited London, and the parties signed a military cooperation plan between the Ministry of Defense of Kazakhstan and the Ministry of Defense of the UK of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for 2025 and 2026. Essentially, the main areas of the agreement are peacekeeping, language training. So you have Kazakh officers and military personnel learning English, and essentially all these proficient military English terminology terms, which will be used in military training. And the UK will be providing education for Kazakhstani military personnel in high military educational institutions in Great Britain. I have to just note that this is exactly what Ukraine did when they joined the NATO-US sort of coalition during the Iraq War in 2003, during the invasion and the plundering of Iraq. Ukraine actively participated in that, and many of the veterans we see today fighting on the Ukrainian side in the SMO were actually veterans of the Iraqi campaign. That is where they gained their military experience. This almost seems analogous to that. Very dangerous. So it's very clear that the Tokayev government is very much not just aligning itself with China, but also hedging its bets, aligning itself with a direct enemy of not just the Russian Federation, but I would say the Russian civilization in general, because the UK is one of these nests of vipers, of hornets, of enemies of mankind. I would say, clearly speaking, this 1 square mile city of London. We don't need to go into details. We have 8 hours dedicated speaking about these bankers, the Rothschilds, and other elites who reside in this particular country, who fund all of these evil organizations and plans to destroy Christianity around the world. Very dangerous alliance here. And I think the Russians should be very wary of what exactly is taking place just south of the border, because the Russian Federation, the border with Kazakhstan, it's not very, let's just say it's a bit more complicated. It's even more unnatural than that of Russia and Ukraine, right? It's essentially drawn by pencil by the Stalin government. There's no logic to it. There's no coherency whatsoever. And the reason why it even matters today, and this aligns with this particular news story here, is that, well, unfortunately, the Russian military has leaked nuclear defense plans on their website. And this was reported by Denmark's Danwatch and Germany's Der Spiegel. These are two big journalistic media companies of Europe. And essentially, it was somewhat confirmed by Russia as well that, yes, somehow the Russian government accidentally uploaded for public viewing up to 2 million internal documents, blueprints, schematics of strategic military missile forces and their bases onto their website. I mean, maybe someone checked the box incorrectly, but they literally allowed all of these documents to be accessible publicly. And what the documents expose, generally speaking, even if they were available for a few minutes, was the full plans of the Yasny nuclear military base in the Orenburgskoye Oblast. And Orenburg, this oblast is located just 50 to 100 kilometers away from Kazakhstan. It's directly aligned with the Kazakh border, basically about 1,400 kilometers away from Moscow. So, central Russia, roughly, not quite Siberia. But what we have here is this base had locations of silo launchers leaked, underground tunnels leaked, secret security systems, living quarters, everything, including sensor coverage zones, the wall materials, what the tunnels were made out of, where surveillance cameras were, including even how the toilet direction, like in which direction the toilet doors would open, right? In or out. Like, all these details were uploaded to the Russian website and made public. So people are saying this is treason. Oleg Tsarev, for example, this is just absolutely ridiculous. It hasn't been really commented on by official Russian mainstream media because this is a leak of Cold War proportions, you can almost say. And just to mention, the avant-garde missiles that are housed in the Orenburg Oblast, these are your classical Cold War missiles, but these are new missiles that were designed in 2019. So for reference, they fly into 30 to 100 kilometers up into the atmosphere. Allegedly, they can fly up to 1,000 kilometers up basically into space, right? Or, up to the firmament. Then they drop down and they glide at a speed of 24,000 kilometers per hour, evading missile defenses. So they're hypersonic. And the warheads they carry, essentially, it's like a big missile and then it breaks off. I'm speaking in layman's terms here, breaks off into many smaller missiles, which again could be nuclear warheads. And the range of these missiles is up to 11,000 kilometers. So yeah, they're intercontinental. And that's what was housed in the Orenburg Oblast. And, the good news, however, Conrad, is that we know for sure that Russian nuclear technologies, at least on the home ground, these bases have been updated. And they've, these are new bases more or less being built. And it's unfortunate that these were leaked. However, I guess we'll have to see exactly how Russia reacts. Will it keep this base active, or will it simply spend billions of dollars and move it elsewhere? So it'll be very interesting to see exactly how it develops. But generally speaking, yeah, a lot of Russians are questioning the Kazakh agreement because it does throw a wrench into the entire CSTO relationship. And we know when Armenia left the CSTO, that already kind of spelled the end of that particular security agreement. But I think Kazakhstan openly cooperating with a NATO country that's clearly funding, not even going to speak about Boris Johnson here, the Prime Minister of the UK, who essentially extended the Ukrainian war by 2.5 years. But the UK is directly responsible for this outright war and genocide of Slavic people in Eastern Europe. And Kazakhstan is not ashamed of cooperating with them to meet its own sovereign nation's ends. So very concerning news. And, we would be completely amiss not to report on it. So let's just hope that Kazakhstan comes to its senses before we see, God forbid, another military operation of some sort to the south of the Russian Federation's border, which I think if I was to, foretell the future, I think eventually something like that will be inevitable unless the Kazakh government normalizes itself with Russia. So we'll have to follow the news very closely and see how all of this develops.
That was all a lot of good stories that we made sure not to miss. And as far as the Kazakhstan situation, maybe an ether hour investigating the Masonic New World Order city of Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, is due, because that's a very suspicious place, just in general. So that would be something we'd like to talk about. But yeah, no, so many things going on regarding, just general World War III right now. And again, the Russian leaks are also extremely concerning. Those have been happening, a lot of those have been happening recently, actually. But we're reaching the end of the show here, so we have to talk about church news. And this is the story, of course, that I've been the most distracted and incensed with. I was already enraged by the removal of Metropolitan Tychikos from his cathedra in Paphos. And now, this is from the Union of Orthodox Journalists. I'm just going to read this here. After Tychikos, the Synod of Cyprus intends to examine the case of Metropolitan Neophytos. The Archbishop of Cyprus has declared that he has discovered heresy within the church. Archbishop George, Primate of the Church of Cyprus, announced in an interview with RIK News that following the deposition of Metropolitan Tychikos of Paphos, the Synod will consider the case of Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphou at its upcoming session on June 23, 2025. In his statement to the outlet, the Archbishop referred to heresy within the Church, which fortunately has been exposed through recent events and the defection of clergy. Speaking about Metropolitan Tychikos, Archbishop George emphasized that he expects from him a confession of faith, which can clearly be interpreted as a renunciation of the views that led to his removal from the Paphos See. The head of the Cypriot Church stressed that if Metropolitan Tychikos does not submit such a confession, then the matter will be definitively closed on June 23rd, the day of the next Holy Synod session. It is worth recalling that Metropolitan Neophytos has previously stated that his beatitude Onufri is the canonical primate in Ukraine, while Epiphanius is not. The Union of Orthodox Journalists in America previously reported that a theologian had described the case of Metropolitan Tychikos as an example of a world turned upside down. And just to report everything before I give my comments, the Metropolitan Tychikos story has an update. The headline here, Cypriot Metropolitan Tychikos appeals deposition to Constantinople, citing procedural violations. His Eminence Metropolitan Tychikos of Paphos has formally challenged his recent deposition by the Holy Synod of the Church of Cyprus, filing a comprehensive appeal with the Patriarchate of Constantinople that automatically suspends his removal from office. The multi-page petition submitted today to the Secretariat of the Holy Synod contests the May 22nd synodal decision that removed him from the metropolis of Paphos by a narrow 10-6 majority vote. The formal charges and the underlying tensions, of course, people know that he was allegedly ordaining a member of a Thessaloniki religious group that operates independently without commemorating the local hierarch, which isn't true. The systematic refusal to celebrate mixed marriages and failure to recognize sacraments of chrismation and certificates of Orthodox faith from other canonical churches, which it said that he didn't refuse the mixed marriage, that he simply asked to meet with the wife, which supposedly caused a problem. And then the other accusation being the consecration of the chapel dedicated to the uncanonized cleric, which, again, we've already proved that Archbishop Georgios, oversaw that multiple of those similar situations. The good thing about this challenge to the ecumenical patriarchate, even though, while we do know that the ecumenical patriarch that sent a letter recommending Archbishop Georgios persecute Metropolitan Tychicus, this does allow him, I believe it gives him 6 months where he is restored as the metropolitan, and Archbishop Georgios is no longer the locum tenens of Paphos, which he had been, in the midst of this deposition. So this is obviously good. And of course, in theory, the people in Constantinople, the Phanar, the ecclesial court, they will have to look into the fact that the rules of the synod were violated, that the 2/3 majority vote was not reached, and that the synodal meeting was reclassified as something else, basically, to allow for what they wanted to happen to Metropolitan Tychicus to happen. So in theory, I mean, I don't know if there's a chance that he somehow gets, reinstated. I don't think that will happen at all because, the Phanar is occupied territory. And I think that there's a solid chance that many of the same characters in the deep state or in, rather the deep state in America, the CIA, the State Department, or rather vestiges with the same influence or under the same control of nefarious parties and groups and cabals that operate in places like Cyprus and Eastern Europe are obviously behind this sort of thing. I can't imagine that the decision against Tychicus won't already be rigged, but I think, again, I think he now will have 6 months where he will still be in charge of Paphos. Perhaps this can allow him to organize in a way with some of his people there to where I don't know. I don't know how these things could, perhaps be remedied. Unfortunately, it's very blackpilling. And the fact that they seem to have thought they've got a victory here, they've got Metropolitan Tychicus' scalp. They seem now to be wanting to move on to Metropolitan Neophytos, which, again, well, it's very blackpilling to see. I just can't see how they actually are able to get him. Because if they only could get a 10-6 vote against Tychicus, I can't imagine that they would be able to get that same vote against Metropolitan Neophytos, who, again, if it was just a 9-7 vote, I mean, what would they even claim? I mean, there's no way where like something that close to a 50-50 vote would allow you to be able to depose a metropolitan, somebody who's been at this point in his episcopal see for almost 30 years, is considered by many to be a living saint. And I find it very unacceptable and blackpilling that this autocephalous ancient church of Cyprus, with roots, dating back to the apostles, is committing this level of persecution against holy hierarchs. And, the sad thing that Neophytos of Kikos sided apparently in the vote against Metropolitan Tychicus is very sad. As I said before, he literally wrote the book on the schism in Ukraine and, how they, the ecumenical patriarch does not have the authority to grant them autocephaly, these sorts of things. I don't know why he would then be voting against Metropolitan Tychicus. The only people that I know for sure supported Metropolitan Tychicus are Metropolitan Neophytos, Metropolitan Athanasios, and then his spiritual children, who several of which have become bishops as well. So that's the situation there. I encourage everybody to pray for Metropolitan Neophytos, the church in Cyprus. Like I said, I was told not to publish the information in the story that I have and that I experienced, original journalism, as it were, about what happened to me and the group of people I was with in Cyprus by what I would assume to be agents of the ecumenical patriarchate or, the archbishop, people from Nicosia. So, he seems to want to allow this to play out. He, I think, is even convinced that the prophecies will begin to unfold rather quickly, and these things will sort of then be dealt with, in the course of events in due time as those things play themselves out. And as we said before on the show, I mean, this summer could be when, that strike regarding Israel and Iran, that could really be when that plays out and is decided and is, made. It's kind of the make or break time period here. So if that does happen, then I think Metropolitan Neophytos' decision to sort of let things play out and not act while God is acting, as it were, is probably correct. However, if that doesn't play out as somebody who, loves him very much and loves the church, I can't imagine that, taking this lying down is necessarily the best case. But of course, I am nowhere near as wise as him. And I think, this is a moment where I think trusting the prophecies actually is actually the prudent thing to do here and is something that, again, could lead to, a resolution that nobody could predict for a lot of these ecclesiastical issues. So before we talk about a few other church news items, I would just love your thoughts on these Cypriot developments, Dimitri.
Just on the face of it, all of the listeners would probably agree that what's taking place on Cyprus, the home of Christianity for 2,000 years since the apostles, is very clearly a crime, an ecclesiastical crime against not just Metropolitan Tychicus, but Metropolitan Neophytos as well. It's very clear that the higher ups, maybe by extension from the Greek government, by the elites who are putting pressure. I doubt this is purely ecclesiastical in nature. I think there's bigger moves taking place, especially when you consider Metropolitan Neophytos and some of his statements condemning the powers of the world. We'll just call it broadly. He's so closely aligned with the teachings of the saints and what the elders have said, the Greek Orthodox elders, actually, who have continued to carry on the beacon and light for Orthodox Christians in the Eastern Mediterranean, that I think people are just upset at him. Since COVID times, the elites want his removal, and so they apply that pressure onto the weak-hearted, lukewarm, and traitorous bishops of the Church of Cyprus, and they're trying to make these big moves. And unfortunately enough, he is a member of the synod itself, so it'll be interesting to see exactly how the synod maneuvers itself around and tries to catch him off guard. And yes, I think we should keep both Metropolitan Neophytos and Metropolitan Tychicus in our prayers, because these two bishops, as I said before in the previous episode, it's just an active case of confessorship and persecution. So no different to what's taking place in Ukraine. Maybe without the prison sentences, but the psychological harm onto them, the pressure on all those around as well, the lack of clarity. And mind you, when these forces and servants of the devil apply pressure onto clergymen in particular, they try to scare them away into schism. Of course, these two holy men will never do that, will never break away, and they'll sort of accept ecclesiastical ruling. They won't be causing any sort of mischief in terms of heresy or schism. But this is what the devil tries to do. He tries to break the church up from within as well as from without. So a clear example of this is needs to be condemned wholeheartedly, and we should all write, actually, to the various dioceses on Cyprus to make our opinions clear, especially if you're a Greek in Greece, in Cyprus, anywhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. You can speak the native language, write emails, letters in Greek. Have it known that the world is watching what's taking place. It's not happening behind closed doors. We can very clearly see, God has connected us, for better or for worse, via the internet to one another, and we can clearly see the persecution taking place in broad daylight. So my hope is that all of this is resolved amicably and forgotten, and these bishops can move on, carrying on the role of shepherds that they've been appointed to by God. However, part of me also doubts that, again, these hounds of Satan will let go and allow all of this to sort of come to pass without any further conflicts and mischievous developments. Yeah, those are my sort of brief thoughts. But again, very powerful testimony, Conrad. I think we should definitely keep track and keep an eye of this story, because nobody else really is covering it, I would say, in this as much detail as we are. And at least we have an opportunity. We have a big audience, our great listeners, of course. Many of them are pious Orthodox Christians, so we need to keep all of these great hierarchs in our prayers. And I guess I'll mention, this is one of the big stories which I think caught my eye, and we posted about it just yesterday on the 5th of June on our Telegram channel. Schema Hegumen Gabriel of the Sochinske Podvorya. This is on a church on the Valam archipelago. These are the holy islands of Valam, located on the northern Ladoga Lake, very ancient Russian territory. This is called the northern island of Athos, essentially. So many saints came from this area, including Saint Alexander Svirsky, one of those most famous Russian saints, great miracle workers. Saints have lived on these islands since the 900s AD to 10th century, over 1,000 years now. So what happened to Schema Hegumen Gabriel? Well, he's been releasing sermons on almost like a tri-weekly basis almost, online. And these sermons are very powerful. A lot of them speak about saints. A lot of them speak about church feast days. He's a very well-spoken, very well-educated schema monk. And he's a priest as well. So he serves liturgy, and then he gives a powerful sermon, 10 minutes, sometimes half an hour long. And he speaks without notes. In particular, we posted on our World War Now Telegram channel his sermon about Tsar Nicholas II, which was incredibly accurate and correct, given so many people have such deluded and torturously incorrect opinions about the late Tsar martyr and his family. But schema Higumen Gabriel does not. So he gave a recent sermon about the Islamic migration, the waves of essentially foreigners that have began flooding Moscow in particular. A lot of their public celebrations when they pray on the streets. This is, again, unheard of before the revolution in Russia. You would never have that. Despite the fact that there were Muslims living in Moscow, there were 4 to 5 mosques. These waves of migrants coming from Central Asia are flooding the Moscow streets. There's all kinds of ghettos. When we spoke to Andrei Afanasyev, we, of course, covered that sort of colorgification of different Russian suburbs within Moscow itself. So that's a whole nother discussion. But Father Gabriel spoke about this element of Islamic extremism that's rising within these communities of migrants, legal and illegal. Really, that's regardless of, the legality, these people do carry an inherent danger within themselves. And he stated very openly that they obey their religious authorities with such a piety and faith that if a mufti ordered them to attack essentially and persecute Russian Christians in Moscow, they would. They follow their imams and muftis to the T, right? Many of them, of course, adhere to certain Wahhabist ideas as well. And, I think Father Gabriel was entirely correct in that sermon, which he gave, and he gave a warning to the Russians of Moscow to stay vigilant and to stay safe and to sort of be wary of the Muslim infestation of their communities. And who responded to Father Gabriel's sermon? Well, the infamous, or I guess famous, one of the heroes of Kursk, General Apti Aronovich Alaudinov, right? So the Chechen general of the Russian armed forces. He's, of course, the head of the Akhmat Spetsnaz brigade. And in his full 5-minute response, he ended up very disrespectfully, and, Lord forgive me for these sort of words, I'm paraphrasing him, but he called Father Gabriel a retard dressed in vestments. Twice, actually. And then he openly stated at the end of the video, anyone who promotes nationalism within Russia should be, and he alluded to this, he said that they should be beheaded. Father Gabriel never mentioned nationalism, but why is nationalism such a bad thing? I guess Mr. Aronovich couldn't really explain that to us. So the general was mistaken on a few counts in this short form video, but disrespecting a Russian Orthodox priest, and because he's a Chechen and he's a Muslim general, he will not answer for his words. Can you imagine, Conrad, if a Russian Orthodox officer of any ranking, be it general, major, colonel, sergeant, lieutenant, if he ever said anything of this sort, called a mufti, a chief rabbi, or an imam of Russia a retard verbally, he would be instantly dismissed, court-martialed. He'd probably go to jail right away. He'd be sent to a Siberian gulag somewhere. But no, the Chechen mafia does hold significant influence. We can talk about this essentially for hours possibly. And yeah, Father Gabriel, and guess who responds again to all this controversy? Well, it seems like the Chechen diaspora, I call it a diaspora because it essentially is one, the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, we have to just call things out where they are. They suspended Father Gabriel's services as a priest. So he's not able to serve liturgy anymore, not able to give official sermons after Orthodox Christian services. He's now a suspended hegumen, schema hegumen, by the way, which is quite a rare and unusual rank in the church generally. So what? A Chechen general has power over the Russian church. He can pressure the Russian Moscow Synod or the Patriarch or whomever made this decision, maybe it was a local bishop, to suspend a priest for giving an accurate sermon. I mean, this is very controversial, but many Russians are speaking out about this. Of course, Yegor Holmogorov, a favorite Russian nationalist historian, Gabriel Doroshin, the veteran of the SMO. Many people are calling this out because it's absolutely outrageous for a priest to be insulted and for that priest to later be suspended. And he had everything the priest said was correctly in line with Orthodox theology and teaching about Islam. There's nothing to be ashamed of here. And this is, again, a dark mark on whatever's had taken place in Russia, ecclesiastically speaking. But this is a very bad precedent. Hopefully it is reversed sooner rather than later. And by next week's World War Now recording, by episode 122, I'm hoping this decision is reversed. But in any case, make sure to follow our Telegram for some updates in this regard. And the third big story of the week, Conrad, I think we'll sort of jointly discuss this as we close the episode. And this was, I think, quite a white pill. And it's good to end on these sort of things because the Rokor Synod, some of our favorite bishops being here, Metropolitan Nicholas, Archbishop Gabriel, and others have met up in New York, and they've released essentially a proclamation, an encyclical of sorts, condemning the re-Sovietification of the Russian Federation. In particular, they mentioned putting up statues of Dzerzhinsky, Stalin, monuments to him in Melitopol, Mariupol, Moscow, the recent train station. They've had a new mural to Stalin reestablished, which was actually taken down during Brezhnev's time as the general secretary of the USSR. So a lot of these monuments to Stalin, to Soviet leaders who persecuted the church, are being reestablished. And there's news that Lenin's mausoleum in Moscow is going to be renovated, which the Rokor bishops actively condemned. They've also condemned comments by a certain professor, and the name escapes me now, but this professor, he's been quite active. I think he's an atheist by faith, but he openly in an interview, I think it was on a radio show, and again, this is incredibly sacrilegious what he said, but in commenting on Tsar Nicholas II, he said that Tsar Nicholas II was such a failure, and he destroyed Russia. And the professor said that if I was in the position of the Tsar, I would have shot him. No, the professor essentially stated that he would have shot the Tsar himself. And the bishops commented on this. They said it was a very ominous statement. I would say more than ominous. I completely agree with the synod. It's actually evil. This person should most likely go. He offended 80 plus million Orthodox Christians in Russia by saying that. Tsar Nicholas II is one of the most venerated saints, and rightfully so. And he's appeared in many visions. Many of his icons are myrrh-bearing. Many of the Orthodox elders have stated just how much they venerate the last Tsar martyr for his service to Russia and his pious family as well. No one should be saying such things in Russia openly. It's not freedom of speech. It's essentially a verbal form of domestic terrorism and demoralization of the Russian people. And yes, just like the city of Engels, just like the Voikovskaya Stanция, named after Pinchas Voikov, a lot of these places in Russia do need to be renamed. So I completely agree with the Synod of Rokor here. And I think they're setting an ethical and a moral question, and they're sending it to Russia and stating that, look, we still exist. Rokor's message generally as the church that survived the communist persecution was that to follow the truth in the light of Orthodox Christianity, which the Russian Empire kept within itself. And Rokor continues to carry on in that service. And I think this message that the Rokor Synod sent is incredibly important. I completely stand behind it. And I'm very thankful that we have such wise bishops leading us in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia to this day, especially when, sometimes the Russian bishops at home on the mainland are sometimes afraid to make these very clear, very outlined statements against the persecutors of the faith, some of these Talmudic Bolsheviks and other degenerate terrorists who have persecuted the faith in the past because they fear offending a lot of their socialist and communist compatriots. But yeah, I completely agree with the Synod here, and I have unequivocal support for their position, and I think many of our listeners would share in that particular reasoning.
No, I completely agree. And, they also talk about the plans to restore, Lenin's mausoleum. Obviously, not only have these statues been placed in Moscow, but we've seen new statues to Stalin in places like Mariupol. So clearly this is part of sort of, this new sort of they're trying to blend elements of the empire and the Soviet times to have this sort of, new Russian world idea where, clearly it's happening both in the capital and on the frontier of Russia's new territorial gains. So this is something that has been thought out, I think, at many levels of Russian society and government. So I don't know how many people are listening to Rokor in Russia. Obviously, Rokor is in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate, so it's relevant. And I'm assuming Rokor said this knowing that they wouldn't come into any kind of ecclesiastical issues with the Patriarchate. But unfortunately, clearly, as what you just demonstrated, Dmitry, it is, you're allowed to say horrible things against the Tsar and the state, and the church aren't really going to do anything. But if you warn against the evils of Islam as a clergyman, you are going to be subject, apparently, to clerical discipline. So unfortunately, I believe there are even people within the Moscow Patriarchate that really need to hear this message and the message from Father Gabriel earlier, considering, again, why haven't we seen the canonization of Yevgeny Rodionov yet?
Mm-hmm.
It's because people are afraid of causing unrest and, all sorts of issues with Muslims. And Putin, of course, recently is wishing all the Muslims in Moscow happy Eid or whatever. Of course, as, all sorts of persecutions are ongoing in the church, he's, talking all about Muslims and talking to them. So clearly Muslims, I guess Muslims just have more rights. If you want to, really kind of stand up everybody,
Mm-hmm.
go to Russia, be a Muslim. Apparently that's what it seems to be to, you just get, maybe you have full rights, but you have full rights plus a few others, I guess if you're Muslim in Russia. So very unfortunate. But again, I encourage everybody to keep praying for Metropolitan Neophytos, Metropolitan Tychikos as well. I can't necessarily imagine that Metropolitan Neophytos gets deposed. He is literally the senior member of the synod. He has been a bishop longer than any other member of the synod and bishop in Cyprus. So again, I can't imagine removing him would go well. If it does, I mean, Lord, truly have mercy on us. That is my perspective. But it is vindication in many ways. I think, Metropolitan Neophytos is probably thanking God for it. He, many people want him to be the archbishop. They want him this, they want him that. But he, ultimately just wants to stay in his metropolis and preach to his people. And I think, the fact that he's being persecuted, obviously, for those of us that follow him and support him and love him and listen to him, it's only a vindication that he is, of course, somebody worth following, because the forces of the air, the aerial entities, the powers and principalities in high places, both politically, institutionally, and of course, like I said, ethereally, are coalescing against him. But again, I consider him a very powerful noetic warrior, so I think he will, come out of it spiritually unscathed, if not, made better for it, through a form of martyrdom here on earth. But again, this is very much a Saint Nectarios-esque situation. So I think we need to pray for the situation there. Obviously, pray for resolution of the schism over the Ukraine issue, pray for the church in the Levant, and in general, just pray. I think at this point, it's obvious that we need a 10th ecumenical council to resolve all sorts of issues. And again, if it's going to take the Third World War to make that happen, like the prophecies say, then so be it. And this summer seems to be, perhaps when we might see that come to pass. And I pray that, the Lord has mercy on us and that we can, repent as the prophecies call for. So again, pray for the church, pray for Metropolitan Tychikos, pray for Metropolitan Neophytos, who is so near and dear to this show. And yeah, the other news wasn't as dramatic in the show, but this church news, I think, was a big deal this week. So everyone be sure to keep it all in your prayers. But with all of that, worldwarnow.co, that's how you can support us here at World War Now. $7 a month, $75 a year. Like I said, there are a number of ways to get a month or two free, so you can get behind the paywall and listen to, at this point, all 81 plus episodes, hundreds of hours of ether hour content, interviews with Father John Whiteford, Abbot Trefon, Father Peter Heers, Cameron McGregor, Vince James, Jim Jatras, all sorts of, Ryan Dawson, all sorts of really big guests, research into all sorts of historical topics, analysis of all sorts of third rail issues, analysis of very controversial things you're not going to hear anywhere else on the internet. So be sure to get behind the paywall there. That's worldwarnow.co. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. I do live streams there every Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m. Central Standard Time. That is World War Live. That's what that's called. You can also follow us on Telegram at World War Telly. Follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Be sure to, again, subscribe on Substack, YouTube, like the videos on both, whether you listen on one or the other. Be sure to like the episodes on both. It really helps us grow here. So again, if you're listening to this and you're looking down and you're seeing the heart thing not hit or the thumbs up not selected, well, I'm talking to you, actually. Go ahead and do that. But again, thank you so much for making it to the end of this episode. Those of you that support us, obviously, are the ones that keep everything going here and keep the show free for those people that want to just hear the weekly news analysis every week. So thank you all so much for listening. Keep us in your prayers. And Dimitri, I will leave you with the last word.
Absolutely. I also want to highlight the importance of supporting us through the algorithm, because again, the algorithm tries to hide a lot of this content, not just from you, our listeners, but from those new people who want to find out some of the great information we have to share with you. Definitely support us just by clicking those like buttons and whatnot. And again, this weekend on Sunday, I wish all the Orthodox Christians a blessed Pentecost. 50 days from Easter, it really, time has flown. But here we are, and enjoy your great feast day coming up this Sunday. Most likely you'll be listening to this thereafter, the holy day of Pentecost. But I wish everybody a wonderful week ahead, and check out Telegram. We'll be posting fresh news there. Thank you everyone for listening.
God bless everyone. We will see you on the next one.